Hello, and welcome everyone to the third webinar in our ongoing series exploring the potential for sustaining and enriching traditional dance. Thank you for joining us. My name is Louise Siddons, and I'm one of the committee members of the Friends of Cecil Sharp House, along with Judith DeWitt, Bernie Culkin, and Brenda Goodrich. We're an independent organization that supports social folk dance primarily in the English tradition through dances, caller workshops, and webinars. We have an active program in 2021, including talent from the UK and the US, so I hope you'll join us for more than just this webinar. Let's turn to today's discussion, which is titled With Your Neighbor, What Can We Learn from Contra About Sustaining Traditional Dance? Our guests are Lindsey Kennedy, Lisa Greenleaf, Andrew Findlay, and Jane Curry, and our primary question tonight, as the title suggests, is what can we learn from each other about building and strengthening traditional dance communities? Lindsey Kennedy has been ECD and Ceilidh dancing since before she could walk, but departed to contra dance during university, where she organized IVDIF in 2010. And I'm not going to try to do that acronym. You want to do it for us, Lindsey?
It's the InterVarsity Folk Dance Festival, which is the UK student-run festival.
Thank you. She now runs Bristol Contra and is also organizing IVDIF this year while juggling her job of project managing eco-friendly timber frame buildings. Coming to us from the US, Lisa Greenleaf calls regularly in the greater New England areas and has been a staff member at dance camps and festivals throughout the country and Europe. Her specialties include traditional and contemporary contras, squares, contra colors training, and English country dance. She's also the organizer for 2 contra series in Concord, Massachusetts. Andrew Findlay started folk dancing while at university in Reading. Jane Curry started a bit earlier, having invaded Bradford University's dance group with some sixth form friends. They were both involved in running the Berkshire Midsummer Folk Festival, Sidmouth, and the 1982 InterVarsity Folk Dance Festival before taking over London Barn Dance in 1983. Both are independent IT consultants, so working from home has been normal for the past 20 years. I want to thank all 4 of you for joining us for this webinar, and I'm going to start by asking you guys if you could just describe what the state of contra dance is right now, where you all are.
Oh, okay, right. Well, as you've just heard, we run the London Barn Dance, which is mostly contra these days, though it didn't start that way. It was originally started by Bernard Chalk, largely as a square and to some extent mixed, I suppose, but with very much a square bias. Became contra, 20 some years ago, I suppose.
Maybe 10 years in.
When John Meacham suggested that that was a good thing to be doing. So it's a series that's been running a long time. We probably ran our 400th event roughly this year, depending on whether you count the lockdown ones or not. We use normally the main hall at Cecil Sharp House, which is pretty big. Our audience, we run on the second Saturday of each month. We usually have about 120 to 140 people. At various points in the past, we've had some much larger events for specific things, and there have also been some very low times with it sort of bumping along at the 50, 60 sort of range, though not in recent years. We've got quite a mixed range of ages, I suppose, in the audience. Many years ago, we were the youngest in the whole thing. That is no longer the case. Lindsey, for example, is sometimes part of the audience, not as often as she would perhaps like these days. But yes, we have quite a wide range of ages. It's probably still biased towards the, let's say, 50 plus. But yeah, we get quite a lot, and this is probably a London thing, or at least a big city thing. We get quite a lot of groups just dropping in who are not regular dancers, but have discovered us on the net or something, and have programmed us in as part of their night out on the town. they can be an interesting challenge sometimes, but we try and bring them in and give them a good time, and some of them come back.
I think we also have evolved over the years. So when London Barn Dance started, we actually had quite a lot of visiting Americans living in London. So it started with quite a young, zesty contra feel.
Yes.
In many ways. And gradually they finished their studies and went home. And we did go through an era where the average age got a lot older and the audience got smaller. And what turned that round was the internet. Because suddenly people started finding us, and the people that found us were young people. Now,
there are probably 1 million students in London, and we've always known this, and we've always thought that's the audience we want coming in. But students in London are harder to reach than students in the campus universities where we were. In a campus university, there is a centre, a social centre. You can go and put up posters in it, and almost everybody sees them. In London, it's not like that. There is no easy way of reaching all those students.
Maybe that's a good moment for Lindsey to jump in and say a little bit about her recent experience of the contra scene.
Yeah, so I took over Bristol Contra about a year, 6 months before this all paused everything, and we have quite a different, not so different, but we definitely have a slightly younger crowd. There is a good group of us that have all moved to Bristol or live in Bristol anyway. It was started by a couple of friends, and they got their friends interested, and they all happen to be about the same age as me. So we have a slightly younger group. We also have the benefit of having quite strong links to the University Folk Society, but it's not we don't get a huge number of the students. But it's also one of the things where at the moment, the students don't actually do that much dancing. The Student Folk Society seems to actually be more about music and some other forms of folk dance, but not contra. So we get a slightly different, as I say, a slightly different crowd. Think drawing on the stuff from organising IVDIV. So IVDIV is the student society, student-run festival, but actually, I'd say it's most of its people are actually just postgrads, have enjoyed going and keep going, but haven't quite got distracted by other things in life yet. And contra there is really popular. It's now more popular than some of the Cayleys, and there is a contra most nights. So it's a weekend festival. There's always a contra Friday night and Saturday night. It has been for the last maybe 3 or 4 years. I'm sure someone in the chat's going to pop up and tell me when it went to two events, not one. But it is something that's definitely growing within the younger generation. Contra is in a good place, especially there. But it suffers slightly from the fact that there aren't actually that many contra specific dance series. There's Bristol Contra, who we're quite young, quite small. There's Alcester, which is sort of Midlands, and then there's London Barn Dance over in London. Occasional things up north that maybe 3 or 4 a year, but wouldn't be entirely, whether you could call them a series is debatable. But it means that actually in some areas of the country, if you don't live within an hour's drive of those locations, contra sort of just stops apart from 1 or 2 festivals that you get to. So that, I think, something that it's hard to get a foothold in, and people knowing what you are when there's actually not that many places to have a go.
So actually, we're short of contra organisers more than anything.
Is that why you helped out when I said I was going to take over Bristol quite so much?
Absolutely.
Quick, there's a victim.
Well, as organisers, you don't get to dance that much at your own event, do you? So you need other organisers so you can go to their events and enjoy yourself.
That's very true. Or we seem to do it quite, I think Bristol Contra, because we're so small, actually, I'm and there's a few people that are, that want it to run as well, that actually between us we managed to like watch the door, but because it's so small we can watch the door from within the dance set. And
one of the worst things about running London Barn Dance some of the time is actually having to sit on the door whilst there's this fantastic band playing in the room and you're sat there on the door.
So it's a question of finding enough volunteers and giving them free entry for a future dance, or giving them free entry for part of that dance. I can just jump in here and tell you, as I'm speaking for all of North America, contra dancing's doing fairly well, although most groups over the last 10 years have reported attrition, numbers dropping. But at the same time, there have been some younger dance organizers who have created their own event. So I think right now for us, a lot of it's basically a generational issue. And dancers my age not going to dances anymore, and older not going anymore, and then attracting a younger crowd. The urban dances have been doing fairly well, and there are lots of dances out in the country and small places that are doing well. And I think one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with, just another opportunity for growth, is the younger dancers are asking for a change in the culture. And it first came about with change in nomenclature for role terms to get away from non-binary role terms. And I would say probably after the pandemic, most urban dances, and we have a lot of them, if you think of the West Coast and the East Coast, and then maybe some of the big cities in the middle, they're going to be going to larks and robins. We did start with ravens, but there were some ornithological questions, so we changed it to robins, and which as a caller is fine with me. But there's still going to be old-time traditional dances that haven't heard anything about these generational issues. Their concern is, I need to get people in the door. Like up in Montana and Idaho, northern Vermont, they haven't heard of any of this generational issue. And another important thing is that we're also, the younger dancers, so that's teenager up through their 30s, they're concerned with what they call a culture of consent. So they want to rewrite some of the social rules. For example, when I first started dancing, if somebody asked me to dance and I said no, it was expected that I would then sit out. That is no longer the case. You don't have to justify why you don't want to dance with somebody. Yes, this creates some interesting opportunities for discussion and being polite, but also consent to twirls and flourishes, because in North America, we love our twirls and flourishes. So a wider conversation about how we're interacting with each other, which has been tough for some older dancers who've always had it their way, and now they're being confronted with time to think about something else. Also, most urban dances are now writing behavior policies, which run the gamut from very nice, easy, gentle suggestions to more hardcore. You may not do this. You may not do that. Every group is different. So in that regard, as Jane was saying, the internet's been great for our organizers to get together. And I will say we have a lot of new young bands and we have a lot of new young callers. And as Andrew said, yep, you got to find organizers to keep these dances going. And if you want to start a new dance, you've got to find organizers. But the talent is there. We have a lot of dance camps, dance weekends. And I'm happy to say that during the lockdown, we have dancing every week in every part of the country that people attend, but I haven't seen that many young people attending them. So we're going to have an interesting transition back. We're going to see what happens.
I think that's probably been similar to what we've seen.
Louise, I think you have a question. She's popped up.
I do. I popped up because Ali has been asking some incredibly good questions in the Q&A, and several of them speak to exactly what you were just talking about, Lisa. So I'm going to try to combine them, Ali. I hope that I do a good job of that. But first of all, festivals. Festivals and weekends, whatever you want to call them, depending on where you are. Do they have a role in encouraging contra? Lindsey, you said that contra had been getting more popular at IFDIF, for example. But could festivals do more to expand the interest in contra, to encourage organizers maybe? And then similarly, Ali's been asking in a couple different ways. Whether the people who come to you to your contra dances also do other dance forms? Do they move from contra to another as they leave, or do they arrive from a different genre? Um, and sorry, I'm piling these questions on because they're just too good not to ask, and you all can speak to whichever ones you want to. But then that idea of a culture of consent, do you think that that is a way to gain an audience beyond the existing contra dance audience, if that word got out that we're working on that as a community?
I'll jump onto the festival one straight away. I started contra dancing because it was a festival. It was on in a room next door, and there was a break in this thing that I was doing, and I heard music, and my mum might have said it was quite good and I should go and check it out. And I started contra dancing, and I really enjoyed it. It was what I wanted to do that's slightly different to Kaylee, and it really worked. I think it's, if you want to try and get someone completely new to that particular style of dancing to come to a dedicated evening, that's quite a large hurdle that you need to encourage them to get over. Whether at a festival, it's really easy for someone to drift by. Like, it's not extra money, it's not extra effort. And with some careful timetabling, yes, I think you can really, really encourage people to step across. There's always discussion of, do you put your big things on at the same time as each other? Like, is it always the big things that get priority, the most popular thing that gets priority? But actually, the reason I stepped into something else was because there was a gap in the timetable for what I'd normally look for. So I went and looked for something slightly different. And I think festivals are pretty unique in fulfilling that.
There was actually a policy of programming to try and encourage that at Chippenham a few years ago. And they would put on a contra ceilidh, a zesty contra ceilidh, just before the main evening ceilidh one night in the same venue. The idea being that the largely younger, energetic dancers who were going to come to the ceilidh might come early and enjoy a bit of contra first. There were unfortunately tensions, particularly with the big name bands who played the evening ceilidhs and their sound checks, which did cause some trouble at times. And for various reasons, I don't think it actually worked in this way. I think it's still a good idea. And you're right, festivals do allow you to sample stuff.
But you're right, the scheduling is crucial, because the other thing that the Zesty Contra missed out on was that it collided with the Equaley, and all the young people wanted to go to the ceilidh in the swimming pool. So you missed them off the front end as well.
Mm.
So does that sound like an opportunity for organizers who are not the organizers of your festival, but who are regional organizers, to work with the organizer of a festival and say, could you do this one thing for us? And could we get some special promotion for this? If you like Kaylee, come to this Zesty Contra.
Yeah.
I mean, I like what Allie's saying. We don't really have that kind of, we do have some festivals like that in the US, New England Folk Festival, and also Folk Life in Seattle. We mostly have dance weekends, which means you already are interested in it. And Lindsey, I was interested in what you said about getting somebody just to come to a dance. We find in urban settings, that's how most new people come, is personal invitation. Either that, or they just broke up or got divorced and they found it in the paper. So I think a personal invitation is really crucial. And then, of course, what you do once that new person gets in the hall, and that's another question of how you keep people together. Louise, can you repeat? Allie had another really, was it the second part of that? The second question you posed?
She said, do contra
Oh,
dancers move between forms? Yeah,
well,
for it.
I think cross-pollination is a really important thing. And right now, for our younger dancers, it's not dancing, it's singing. There are singing weekends popping up. And I know that is a lot of great energy. And if we can figure out how to tap into that, we can get them to a contra dance.
So I think in our area, almost everyone at Bristol Contra and in my sort of friendship circle, we all do other dancing. Now, that's primarily driven by if you only contra dance, you're not going to dance very much. So it's partly need, but I think almost all of us have definitely done Kaylee because that's a far bigger and more available thing in the UK. But we almost all do some form of partner dancing, whether that's bal folk or whether that's swing or blues. And I think, in a way, contra forms that bridge between Kaylee dancing, which is slightly disconnected, and stuff like swing and bal, where there's a lot of connection and sort of weight balancing with your partner, but it's only with one person. Contra is a sort of blend between the two. So actually, we pick up people from both sides. And each of them have their own thing that they like about contra, and it's something that complements the dance scene. And in Bristol, what works well is actually making Bristol a destination for the weekend by liaising with the bal folk dancers. So they do something Saturday, we do something Friday, and it creates enough of a those people that are slightly out of area go, oh, there's two dances. Oh, and there's lots of people that are really welcome, like open to having people stay on floors. Right. That makes a destination. And that, I suppose, that then also cross-pollination, you can get a whole weekend of dancing done.
Yeah, it's another aspect of programming, really, isn't it? I mean, in the London area, we benefit from actually another contra series which you didn't mention, which is the Englefield Green one, which it runs on a Sunday afternoon, and usually, not always, follows London Barn Dance the next day. And that means that for some people, it's worth making a longer trip. So we have people come hundreds of miles on those weekends.
And that's punters and bands and callers sometimes.
Yeah.
So we liaise with Englefield Green, and often if we've got a band and or caller travelling a long distance, they'll do both gigs.
Yeah, there are different styles. London Barn Dance, we try to be very inclusive. Anybody who's prepared to come through the door, we will try to get them involved, get them on the floor and dancing. And the callers know that they have to cope with whoever comes. Englefield Green is a bit different. It's never advertised. It's entirely word of mouth. And it was largely run by Barry Bullimore, who's now moved away, actually, but he likes the more complicated stuff. And so it's not an easy dance to just turn up at if you don't know contra. But for all that, it has become quite successful. And the combination within the weekend has been helpful to both, I think.
So getting back to what Lindsey was saying about, well, and also actually, Andrew, about what London Barn Dance feels like for people, that there's a expectation that the caller is going to work harder at getting everybody involved. I'd be curious to know what all of you do. What are the positive ideas you have for retaining new people who come?
Well, that's one of the reasons why, at least in the first half, either Jane or I is always on the door. It tends to be Jane because I'm the one that's wandering around getting food for the band and that sort of stuff. But we're there to talk to people. We keep a close eye on who is coming in. So even if we're on the dance floor and dancing, we always notice when a group of people we don't recognize comes in. And we try to make sure that we go and invite some of them to dance or talk to them. And quite a lot of our regulars are getting good at doing that as well.
And you talk to them as you come in. Where did you find us? Why have you come? If they look nervous, I would say, come in and give it a try. If it doesn't work, you can leave after 2 dances. We won't charge you anything. If you're enjoying it after 2 dances, come back and pay us.
We have the same thing, especially at the dances I'm involved with in Massachusetts and Concord. our door sitters, who are always volunteers, they're trained to find a committee member and say, you've got 3 new ones, they're over there. And it's the committee member who's not sitting at the door who will then go and maybe find them partners, good partners.
Yeah.
Which is like your angel dancers. Lindsay, what do you do when people first come in the door to help them feel welcome?
We're a little bit less sort of active, in the sense that there's a smaller team of us. It's often a lot more obvious when there's someone new, because there's, you know, our maximum number is only about 50, so
yeah,
we're a lot smaller. We have been running a beginners sort of session just before the dance, and I make sure I'm also quite open with my callers, and say we're really varied. Some weeks, like some months, we'll get a very like a very intermediate advanced sort of set. Everyone's contra danced before, and sometimes we get quite a beginner mix. And as long as I feel like if I warn the callers that we might get a mix, and I'll try and sort of scuttle up to the side and go, yeah, we've got 5 new ones this time. Like that's 10% of the room. Like that can be tricky. But the beginners session is hit and miss. Sometimes actually it's really intimidating as a beginner, like, oh, we've run a session, it's especially for you. Like that's actually, I personally would hate that. So it's something that I've not really enacted.
I have a point to that. As a caller, I know that. And I like to call it the welcome session.
Yeah. I think we just sort of take...
That's a terminology thing again, isn't it? The real trouble...
Everyone knows what it is. It doesn't matter what you call it, everyone knows.
A good night out and are not part of the folk world necessarily. They might have done a bit of folk dancing at a school event once. They're not going to show up at the beginning. They will not walk into a cold hall. They want to walk into a buzz. And so a beginner's session just doesn't work. If we're contacted in advance by a big group that's being organised, we always offer. But it's rare that they actually take it up. So we just cope with them as they arrive. And I think I only recall one event where the event nearly collapsed because we had too many beginners for the people that we had available to look after them.
That's really interesting, because I would say, especially in the Northeast and maybe on the East Coast, I can't speak for the West Coast, dances that didn't used to have welcome sessions, beginner sessions, because there was already enough attendance that we just felt like if you go, you're just going to be moved along by everybody else. But that's part of this new cultural shift of we want to be welcoming.
I think the other thing is, as people come in, as Andrew says, it's often me on the door. I do try to explain some of the culture. So often people come as a couple. So I would say to them, contra is a bit different. We do tend to trade and swap between each dance. So don't worry if somebody comes up and asks you to dance. This is normal. And you'll find it's a lot more fun if you dance a few with somebody else, and then you can go back and have fun with your partner as well. And I think that contra in particular, this culture of changing partners is very beneficial to help.
It's good for all of us, actually. We all learn from it. And it's what we particularly enjoy about it, actually.
But it does make it more accessible to people who've just walked in the door and think, ooh, did we really mean this?
Definitely. I think it also crosses over with some other dance styles that are sort of other sort of cultures in the UK. So swing dance has been getting very, very popular over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, maybe a slightly bit earlier. But swing, you know, you go to a class, it's really, really regular now. You turn up, you're paired up, doesn't matter whether you come in groups of 1, 2, 5, you are all just split up, and every two or three turns you are made to move to the next person. Like that's just the culture. And as soon as that is becoming what people outside of folk expect, and that's becoming something they might have interacted with before, the culture of turning up to a contra event and everyone swaps partners, everyone, like At Bristol, we don't really have any sort of booking ahead. Like you might see someone and go next dance, but not really any further than that. It means actually it's really easy to finish a dance and go, oh, right, well, I won't, my neighbour, oh, do you fancy a dance? And it sort of flows, and it's something that I think works really well swapping into other things.
Because Lindsey, I know you have a great thing about cheese.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure how it happened. There's a caller in the UK, and he's quite obsessed about cheese. It's also one of these things that, like, if there is
to Meg as well.
Yeah, there's quite a few, but we wound up with an interval activity, which was the cheese board, and it worked really, really well. And we now have the cheese board. There's cups of tea as well. There are definitely some people that come across from sort of very much a folk club where there's the tea and that's it. You queue up, you get your cup of tea, you go and sit down. There's a few people that do that and then realize that you can't take that much cheese away with you because we're very crafty and don't provide plates, which creates this hub. And everyone's there. Everyone has an icebreaker. They all talk about the cheese. Have you tried that one? Oh, have you seen these biscuits? They're different. And it's really interesting to observe that after the break, there is so much more people dancing with other people out of different friendship groups because everyone's been slightly forced and bribed. I think bribe is the correct word to come up and mix in a different way. And I think that my personal feeling is that if you build a community rather than just an event, people will come because they've met people they like, they vaguely know they'll find someone to talk to. It's an open environment, and it's something that I think is working well. Just before, we were slowly tracking up with our numbers just before COVID. We'd gone from Bristol Contra failing because we only had 10 people in the room and it wasn't sustainable to a bit of a reboot and getting up to 50, 60 people. So I personally think cheese for the win. I'm selling cheese.
So let me ask though, if you're in a larger urban dance with a lot of people who may scatter, where you may not have the funds,
it's much harder.
But I think there are things that organizers can do to build community. I know for us, a lot of it is because of the internet. You have either on Facebook or you have a dedicated chat area. And I mean, if all else fails, you ask a question of your community, boom, people are going to have an opinion. It's really great. So, I mean, that's one way. Food is always a great one, but it won't happen the same way as it does for Lindsey with only 50 people. Jane and Andrew, do you do anything at the break special? Or
neither of those? And we can't do the cheese one because C Sharp House has its own caterers and we can't tread on their toes. Yeah, there is a bar downstairs. Some people go down to the bar. Sometimes there are sandwiches available. Sometimes there aren't. It's one of our grumbles, I suppose, about the management of C Sharp over the years has been that the catering has been inconsistent and not always helpful.
There was a time when people would come early to London Bar Dance to have Jerry's sandwiches.
That's a great
on
idea.
a Friday night, and we'd go straight from work and we'd go there and we'd get this massive, great doorstop bacon sandwich, which would keep us going for the rest of the night.
I see a common theme here is food. Louise, you popped up again.
Or the water fountain. The water fountain queue at London Barn Dance is quite a chatty place to be.
It is, because the water fountain isn't good enough. But yes, good point.
It's right up in a corner. So I suppose for us, we would, in a perfect world, move the water fountain to be in the middle of the cafe. But Englefield Green, part of the reason why that's done so well
is bribery.
Is Joyce Bullymore makes cakes to die for.
I call that manipulation, not bribery.
Well, all right.
I want to get, if we could, I want to get Louise in. I think she has some Q&A.
I do. I just wanted to pick up on that idea of community because Ruth has asked. She says, another way that some young people in our area of Central North Carolina got started is through community dances, which encourage families and people of all ages to come. And I wondered if any of you have sort of that that feeder community of family dances, or if Kaylee's work in a similar way, or if there are ways that people who get involved as very young children then grow up and move into regular contra dance communities.
40 years ago, I might have said yes, because at that time there was quite a lot of country dance taught in English schools, but that seems to have disappeared. I think there are probably still Parent-Teacher Association barn dances occasionally, but I don't think the children get anything much. The festivals do it.
I suspect most of the youngsters, I mean, children rather than young adults that we see, are probably second or third generation folkies anyway. Certainly if we get people turn up with school age children, I will immediately create a family price, which is quite a good discount.
Oh, excellent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent idea.
We had a couple of families. We have a couple of families that come to London Barn Dance, not London Barn Dance, Bristol Contra, the other one. And it was discussed. Well, what's the price for a child? And I just said, well, what price do you need it to be to make sure that you come?
That's brilliant.
So actually, the child pricing for Bristol Contra was invented on the spot, and it consisted of 0. And it was, well, if they get a part-time job, we'll reconsider. Because in the end, actually having the kids there is really nice. Like they're obviously enjoying it. They run around just outside, or they're asleep on next to the stage. It's a really nice feeling. Those parents can come. They know the kids are welcome. And I wouldn't want to be excluding because we're pricing out. Now, it's talking to the wider world. I don't think there's any particularly children or community of that sense, like whole family contra events, but there's definitely Kaylee's series in the UK that are community child friendly and held in the afternoon.
And things like folk camps and the festivals and things.
I can say that North America definitely has a lot of community they're family dances that you can come with your family, and there is a price cap. So that, if you have a family of 4, you don't. And also quite often at these dances, which I think is great, it's a community band that you have 1 or 2 anchor musicians, but they welcome kids. That's the best thing, is to see those kids up on the stage. And actually, speaking of pricing, that's another way to entice people to come. How do you adjust your pricing, or have you adjusted your pricing over the years because you want more university students or you want more younger people?
Well, I'll give a very straightforward answer, and then you'll get the interesting one from Lindsey. Our pricing model is to look at other events that go on in C# House and say we can't be too far off those. And actually, we've probably, by the standards of London entertainment, we're very cheap. We're not charging enough.
Right.
I can't even remember what we are charging now. It's so long since we did it. It's a year.
£12.
£12. Yes, okay. £12.
We have to keep on buying £2 coins.
Right.
Lindsey, how about you?
So we were charging £10 for an adult ticket, but it was really obvious that wasn't sustainable. We either needed to up numbers or up prices. So actually, we have done something quite different. We now have a tiered or almost pay what you feel type. So we did one event which was pay what you feel, and the whole concept was so new that there were quite a lot of people that were just finding it quite. We're Brits. There was quite a lot of awkwardness and but someone hasn't told me what I should do. So that collapsed. So the next month we went, right, well, let's put some suggested figures next to these things. So our suggested figures are £6 for students, £10 for adults, and £15 as a supporters fee. And we're quite clear that if you pay any extra money over £10, that money goes direct to the artists. It won't get.
That's brilliant. I love that.
And the first month it happened, there was definitely confusion. A lot of people reading this sort of, and we did an honesty, like there was nobody on the door. It was an honesty box, so no one had any judgment over what they put in or didn't put in. And as it went on, by about the 6th or 7th time, we were getting over 50% of people paying the higher amount. We were getting some people going, I haven't quite got the higher amount, but here it is. But what we did find is that it wasn't a generational divide over who could pay more and who could pay less. So students and OAPs paying less and everyone in the middle paying more didn't work, because there actually were some OAPs that had plenty of surplus, like they could afford, and that was fine. But there were some others that couldn't. So we felt that by splitting up in a very, very generational thing, it didn't work. And I think this tiered system, I will not be changing. It works really well. It definitely puts far less pressure and the less barriers for the people that would like to try it. It doesn't alienate and force people to make a decision on what event they should do each month. And it is providing a far fairer stream of income for the callers and the bands. And in the end, we're not going to be able to support a music scheme if a culture in the UK unless we can actually pay the artists and callers, because they do a lot of work. If we can't pay them, we're not going to ever have a country community.
Yeah, I think we'd like to do something similar. And to a certain extent, we do. As Jane says, we make up numbers for families, which basically means the kid's free. But also in the last year or two, C# has insisted on, well, very nearly insisted on taking over the doorkeeping, but we fought that one off because we like to talk to people coming in. But also taking over doing advanced booking, which admittedly is something that we weren't doing and sounded like a useful idea. And they said, right, what are your ticket prices? And well, it took them quite a long time to actually get it right anyway. But effectively, the advanced booking, people are choosing a ticket price out of a list. So it's very similar. And maybe we should be doing that on the door as well. As you said, it'll probably take a while for people to get used to it. But it's working on the lockdown things.
Yeah, right.
It's working at IFDIV. It's working at Jen Morgan, who does quite a lot of the organising of folk dance in the Midlands. She separately, bizarrely, we both came up with a very similar system and enacted it about the same time. And that's definitely providing a way of smaller events to basically break even, because it's a way of being able to go, actually, no, I really, really value this. I can chuck some money into the pot, more money into the pot. This works. So I think there's a general shift in the UK. I wouldn't be surprised post-lockdown there's more of it, because the tip jars and paying voluntarily has become more part of it's the only way to do it at the moment.
Right.
Yeah.
In the US, I can say that it varies. You have a dance in Los Angeles that could cost you $18, which is, by New England standards, that is a lot. We might be paying $10 or $12, but it depends on your overhead, how expensive your hall is.
How big a dance would that be? How many people?
Oh, it has nothing to do with how many people. It has to do really with overhead. I can't tell you what the LA dance, maybe somebody here is 80 people to 150 maybe. I mean, our dances get between 80 and 150. And many dances have a age price, not student price, but age price, 21 and under. And others are going to this sliding scale because we have a very active organizers chat, organizers at sharedweight.net. So people have talked about how they have done this, and it's great. And one of the things I think is important, especially for younger dancers, is when I hear that people are shying away from coming to the dance because they can't pay, I make this announcement almost every time. If you are having trouble paying, volunteer. I have a job for you. Now, I've had to create some jobs. I don't care because I want them there and I want them to know that you can come. Plus, then I have a volunteer to sweep the hall. It's fabulous. Louise, did you have some comments or questions from the chat, the Q&A?
There are a few things scrolling through the chat, but I'm carefully
All right.
ignoring.
There are lots of things everywhere, exactly. Well, it's interesting to me that at the very beginning, there was a question about reaching students, and it seems like this conversation about pricing and all of that has made it clear that it's not generational, it's not student professional. There's other things happening in terms of community divides or things that are preventing people from feeling comfortable showing up. And I'm wondering if any of you have thought, sort of as a follow-on to that question, of how to reach out to students in particular, or people who are either younger or maybe less able to pay for it or perceive that as a barrier. If you've had conversations or productive things
uncomfortable.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I don't think there's something specific that's putting them off. It's not money, it's not I'm afraid to go or anything like that. I think it's just that they don't even know it exists. In
so
a
maybe
city
we
like
could
London, there
talk
is so
about
much stuff
advertising.
competing for attention. Well, advertising, yeah, at times we've spent money on advertising. At times we've gone round and distributed leaflets. But really very little of it had any effect other than being pretty much the first folk event in the UK to have a website. And that goes back to before most of the world, including American politicians, knew that the web existed. Who was it? Which president said he'd invented it? Anyway, it was before that.
He wasn't president, he was vice president. But that's
was it? Oh, right, okay. Well, we had a website before he invented the internet. So that eventually, I think, got us quite a lot of our younger audience. And
social media has been great as long as you know
if you're
which
prepared to
platforms,
engage with it. And I have to admit, we're not.
Well, you say that, but Lindsey and Ali.
Yes, okay. Do some of it on our behalf. That's true.
And Andrew.
London Bond
recently, but he did the bulk of it for a good couple of years.
Lindsey, what do you use?
It's a question of having a number of different routes. And somebody mentioned this earlier. I think in the context of dancers often arrive because they are brought to a dance. But word of mouth, if you can get somebody there, however, hopefully by word of mouth, maybe, you make sure they have a good time. A vast proportion of the people who just turn up off the street at London Barn Dance don't come back. But a few do, and they bring their friends. Once somebody's come back 3 times, you've got them. If you work on keeping them and making sure they have a great time.
Yeah, I think partly I think each different contra series is going to have its own challenges, and it's partly knowing your audience and knowing your people. So specifically for Bristol Contra, when I and actually one of the students, the student folk society took over the contra when it collapsed because they didn't actually know anyone else was around that was interested in taking it on. So they took over for a month. But I then worked alongside one of the students to timetable out the next year. And my instinct was to make sure we didn't clash with the very popular Cayleys. We didn't clash with the really popular folk festival down the road that happens once a year. And actually planning out which weeks. There were some things that I'd never have thought of. Don't put on your event the week of exams. Put it on at the end of exams. Don't put it on if term starts Monday, no one's there on that the Friday before, so put it on the Friday there. And actually, once you'd scanned out, you put all these things in. Actually, it was really obvious. And why hadn't we actually looked, not just when the students are in the city, but what's their focus? And by doing that, I think, we open up the ability to the students to attend at all versus not. So that was something that was quite an eye-opener. The other thing was making assumptions about the audience without knowing what's going on. So we were in a hall that was actually in the area where the students lived, because an assumption was made that the students didn't have cars, they'd need to walk, and therefore we needed to be close to them. But actually 95% of the people that attend the contra drive or come by local transport. So we shifted to somewhere in the absolute arse end of nowhere, right next to the station with a car park. Suddenly we have people driving from Exeter, we have people coming from the Midlands, we have people coming from London, because it's now only an hour and a hour's train ride and you're right there. Or you can come, you can drive, doesn't matter how horrendous the motorway is, there's parking right next to the venue. And that took down a barrier that I think no one had really considered. So it's really targeting what works for you specifically, and people coming on the trains, a big part of the people that come. So we swapped it out to be that.
Yeah, it's us.
Yep. And with London Barn Dance, like when I attended regularly, actually the barrier for us was London Barn Dance didn't start till 8, but you'd get out of work at 6:30. So there would be the temptation of drifting home. So we started, of the people that we knew, of sort of anyone that we knew was coming out of town, there was a few of us that went, we will be in this cafe come restaurant at 6:30, we'll be there until 10 minutes before the dance. And we got people drifting in that we didn't know especially well, we'd seen at festivals, but would come. And that made quite a good link for our generation that had been, that weren't driving. We were coming on public transport, but we didn't really want to hang around anywhere for an hour. Well, we put something in place to enable that. And I think it's finding those things that work for your specific contra that can make a really big difference.
I can say that one of the youth contras, or probably youth isn't the right word, but that formed in the Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts area, they purposely went to Cambridge because of public transportation. They knew that a lot of their friends lived in this circle where it was hard to have a car. And of course that's true. So those of us coming in from the suburbs, it's difficult to park, but they did it on a Sunday when parking is free. So they at least thought about that. Yeah, but I think those are brilliant ideas about transportation, and don't be afraid to move your dance.
No.
Yeah. Louise, do you have anything you want to ask us?
Okay, so at the very beginning of the webinar, I said that one of the things that we wanted to do is figure out how to learn from each other. And Graham asked a question quite early on that I think is a good one in terms of our audience, and maybe is particularly applicable for Lisa and Lindsey, who have a lot of English dance experience. I don't know, Jane and Andrew, if you guys ever do Playford style dancing, but he asked how Contra's lessons, how all the things we've been talking about so far tonight can apply specifically to the English dance community. And I know there are a lot of differences between English dance communities in the US and the UK, so maybe also thinking about how you see the relationship between those, and if you do think lessons apply in either direction.
Well, we don't do what you call ECD and we call Playford. Partly, I suppose, because we prefer contra, but also historically, Playford was not welcoming at all. It was largely danced by people 3 times our age. And if you didn't already know it all and get it perfectly right, they looked down their noses at you. And in some of the clubs, you had to know which seats you weren't allowed to sit in because they were going to be sat in by somebody else who would be coming later. Now, they really were that anti-new people. So it was.
I think English dancers are aware of that. English organizers, especially in the US, English country organizers, are aware of that perception. and they are working hard to change it. And besides talking about the culture of English dancing, getting to Graham's question, I think, yes, there are things you can learn just in that idea of, are you serving your constituents? Is your location right? Are you creating a community before or after? I think any dance can do that. A cafe before, a pub afterwards. What do you do during the dance? What do you do at the door? I think all of those things could be applied to any kind of social dancing to create a community. I mean, obviously, if you think, well, gee, why does that contra dance have so many people? I'd go to that dance and find out what is so good about this dance, and can we do it at our English dance?
There's a lot.
Instead of being jealous, go and look and steal.
There's also one other thing which we haven't mentioned, and that's consistency of product. And I think this is one of the things where London Barn Dance has been successful, where some of the other events at C Sharp House have not been so successful. And that is that if someone does start coming to us regularly, they know what they're going to get. And it's the same style and largely the same standard and largely the same quality of performers. So they're not going to be badly disappointed if they put the effort in to come. Because actually, for most people, the effort of physically getting to C Sharp House is much more costly to them than the cost of the ticket.
And the other thing, being consistent, is to have a consistent date so that people know London Barn Dance now is the second Saturday. People from the 80s knew it was the second Friday, and it was quite a major shift to move it from Friday to Saturday.
And we don't clash with Bristol because Bristol organised to not. And we don't clash with this and that and the other. So there is a pattern to all the dances around. So all of those that have overlapping audiences try to have a pattern that's repeatable through each month. So
and coordinated. And I think that's actually key, especially in my area, because there are so many little tiny dances and you have to look at the entire calendar and say, oh, somebody already has a dance on the second Saturday. Do we really compete with them, and should we move? And I love that. And I love that when organizers talk to each other about that. We're starting a new series. Do you see any problems with that?
It's a good thing to do. We don't have enough dance series to really need it. It's a service to some extent that set and turn.
But you might have new organizers.
But Lindsey very definitely came round and talked to us and talked to Meg, because I think originally, Lindsey, you weren't quite so fixed on a definite pattern.
No, actually, it was one of the things that actually was pretty hard to put down, because one of the things that, so Bristol Contra had existed and was quite steady. There'd been a couple of changes of organizer and it had collapsed through lack of numbers. And it's really what I was presented with. One of the reasons I moved to Bristol was there was contra dance. And I was presented with there is no longer contra dance unless I pick it up. So, right, what can I do to retain the people that are already coming and improve to make sure that we've got a steady source, very selfishly, of dances for me?
That's exactly why we're running London.
I did.
That counts. That counts.
I went
passion.
to the people that I knew. I went, help. I need Contra to survive. Please download all the information in your experience. Share with me how I can make this work. And one of the things that I think when I first talked to Jane and Andrew was I didn't have a date. But there was a choice that I had to make. And the choice was to go close enough to Alcester and London Barn Dance in terms of calendar, that if we had an American band come over for a short, like a week or 2 weeks, that we could have the American band play at us as well. Or to split and go the opposite we're the end of the month here, where London Barn Dance is sort of early mid-month, to spread out the number of contras so that the people who were travelling for Alcester or London Barn Dance one weekend weren't doing the same to Bristol the very following weekend. We've got a gap, so there's now a spread, and it's not overload in one area of the month and nothing somewhere else. But the downside is that we can't loop into the touring musicians and callers without changing our time. Now, the second sort of thing is that actually Bristol Contra is gender free. So actually, when we started looking at this really closely, the American callers that were coming over this year didn't do gender free calling. So it wasn't even an issue. Like, actually, where we put our dance worked. But there will be a question in the future of, is it worth moving our regular time to be able to have a band play? That would be something. And it's a bridge that I've decided I'll cross when I get to it, because until we've got something that's steady on their feet, actually we can't really even afford those bands. We have to build something that's working before we get ambitious. And that's what's worked for us. But I think moving on slightly in the discussion, I think there's also an element of, when you link in and see organisers, it's whether you see them as competition for your dance, or whether together you're building a community or an environment that's bigger than you as an individual. I think seeing that mindset is very different. You're not competing with Kaylee, you're not competing with Playford and Contra. You're all providing different corners of the same community. And how that's talked about, I think, has an effect.
Is there a UK site where people who are organizers of social dance talk? We have one in the US, mostly for contra dancing, but
I think it's at Chippenham and around pizzas, isn't it?
But you don't have a web chat or a...
Well, some long time ago, we set up the Contra Corner mailing list, another of John Meacham's ideas. At the moment, it's tending to be an announcements list, but originally it was a discussion. And that's still its remit, is for people who want to discuss running Contra events.
Well, if any of you are interested, you're welcome to join organizers with a Z at sharedweight.net. And that is not about announcements, and it's a well-moderated list, and it's all about, here's what's going on with you. It's basically what we're doing now, people sharing ideas. And you would most certainly be welcome to join those discussions.
Well, I was about to pop in and say we have about 15 minutes left. So first of all, if anyone in the audience has a question, now's the time to ask it, or it won't get asked. And second of all, I was wondering if maybe part of the conversation about, maybe jumping off what Lindsey was saying, really about how we could think of ourselves as collaborators and kind of colleagues instead of competition, how you would describe maybe the core values of your experience with social dance and the values that you try to convey in the dances that you run and participate in and call for.
Be welcoming.
If they don't enjoy it, they won't come back.
I think being clear with what you're what you're promising, like write something on the tin and then provide that. So Bristol Contra does have a sort of code of conduct / this is what to expect from an evening. And I think as being more open about that and saying, well, this is what to expect, actually helps clarify, well, you know, what are you going to get? What are you not going to get? And that part helps then build a community inside that share those values. And then you're halfway there between, don't need to be relying on volunteers or committees. You've got a whole community that's sharing those same views and moving forwards with that.
One of the things that's happening in the US because of the code of conduct is when it's time to make announcements, and I love this. Each series, I mean, this isn't universal in the US, but it's happening a lot in New England. they state their vision, they state their mission statement. We are an open, welcoming, inclusive dance. Our goal is to have safe, satisfying dancing. I mean, it's like 3 sentences, but that sets the tone right there for everybody attending. And then if you have any questions or compliments, notice we don't use the word complaints or concerns. Here are your committee members, and they raise their hands so that they get recognition, and also people know where they can go. And I love that as a way of setting up what is your vision for your series. And I would hope that anybody running a program would have a mission statement.
Lisa, do you have any sense of how often the organizers get feedback about that? And have they ever had pushback, or how do they deal with that? And Lindsey,
What
kind of
kind
the same
to their
question
mission
for you.
statement? Absolutely
Well,
not.
no, to the idea of like, here's our vision, and sort of I mean, I guess really I was asking about the switch to gender free in Bristol, or I know that in the broader community, when codes of conduct started to become popular, there were some people who did push back saying, we don't need this. And so how those conversations happen is interesting to me as an organizer and a caller.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, because the gender-free issue is big in the US, and I learned so much because I watched dances that were mostly being run by 20 and 30-year-olds. And you know how they addressed it? Because they knew they had older dancers and they had younger dancers that they were trying to attract. They had a community-wide discussion that lasted months. I'm specifically thinking of Montpelier, Vermont. They told people about this, and they said, so every time we have our dance, I don't know what it is, twice a month, once a month, we might be using new nomenclature. We want your feedback. And they would advertise it. This dance is Larks and Robins tonight. We want your feedback. Come and try it. And what happened was those people who were against it or just resistant, because they were being heard and listened to, and because, more importantly, they listened to the people who wanted this, as a community, they decided. Amherst did the same thing. They had a big chart, and you could just slap a star on the thing that you wanted. And so it was community engagement and not just a unilateral, because it's a big shift for people. Mm-hmm. So that worked. Yeah, the codes of conduct, the behavior policies, mm-hmm. those are still big discussions. And that's where having web chats has been really helpful, because we can see examples and figure out, well, which one of these fits our group? And I like what Lindsey said about, we post them, there they are. Ours are fairly friendly, we hope, and accessible. You're welcome to talk to us about them. And we haven't gotten real pushback about that. But our committee members do get feedback during the dance about any number of issues, which I think is great. We want to hear from people.
Yeah. Lindsey, was there a lot of conversation when Bristol went gender free?
Bristol's always been, there was never any swapping about it since, like, so it started in 2016 and it was gender free from the start.
Fantastic, right.
And so therefore there has been no discussion about whether to swap to it. It's something that I've inherited, and there's a lot of people that are going, no, we really want it. There's definitely, there has been mooted of like, well, we've got a caller from America that's coming over who doesn't. Do we do one dance that isn't gender free? And that was definitely a discussion point, but there's not been so much open conversation. And I think as a result, it's very hard to filter out whether it's a few very loud voices that are shouting for something, or actually if that's the consensus as a whole. At the moment, Bristol, I'm not going to swap it away from what it is. Like in the UK, the whole gender-free sort of calling discussion is ongoing. I think it's going to, I don't quite know what it's going to pan out as. I don't think any of us do. But it works in our area. It links in with the other things that our local area are doing. And at the moment, it's not hampering our ability to get bands or callers. So why change it?
And for us, it's completely the reverse. We have no apparent demand for gender-free calling. We have some people who regularly tell us that over their dead body will we even consider it. And actually it doesn't seem to matter because people dance whichever side of the set they want to dance anyway. And yeah, they don't really care much about the labels. So it's all about the dancing, not about the gender politics, if you like. So we're keeping out of it.
Andrew, one of
and
the
we're
things
also keeping out of the codes of conduct thing. And that might be partly because of where we come from. We live in a community that has a fair number of rules. And most of the time this works quite well. But there are always people who will read rules and then say they must be applied to the letter in all circumstances. And in our case, the rules were written in about 1955 and they don't work anymore in some cases. And if you try to apply them to the letter, then you end up being barrack room lawyers. And this is not positive. If we don't need it, we won't do it. So we're sort of leading by example, and it's working for us at the moment. If we end up having to go the lawyer route, I don't know, maybe we'll just give up entirely. It's not what we do.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier that I think also speaks to sort of setting an example and expectations was that you think that an important part of London Barn Dance's success has been the quality of the callers and musicians. And Ali has asked if any of you have any advice about working with bands to add to the sense of welcome at your dances. That to me, there's a difference between sort of, we have top tier bands and we have bands that people are excited because they become a part of the sense of community. Not necessarily a distinction between those two things, but that bands work differently in different contexts or can do different things. So.
Know your band. In the early days, we've always tried to pay a reasonable going rate, and for many, many years there's been an understanding that if it's a good night, then people get more. But we tend not to go beneath the minimum. That said, in the early days, the thing that was most appreciated was that you bought a model of a London boss for John Chapman, and you had 3 boxes of Jaffa cakes for Arden folk, 1 for each of the guys. And they appreciated that far more than paying them.
So that's sort of liaison and interactions with bands. In terms of what the bands can do to help the community as a whole, I think that's a little harder because it tends to be the caller that interacts more directly. The bands certainly drive the dance, and you want bands who will do that, certainly. But they're normally slightly one step back, as it were, from the dance community. That's been less so during the lockdown events because there isn't an obvious stage that people sit on in solitary state. So bands and audience are much more mixed up in that sense.
And I have to say, in lockdown, the bands and the callers have worked about 10 times harder than they would, yes, even if they'd had to drive 200 miles before, set up, run the gig, tear down, drive 200 miles back. They have still worked a damn sight harder in lockdown for us and for everybody. This is, as Lisa said, partly why we run a tip jar and try and pass on whatever we can to these people.
Which is tending to be pretty close to what we would have paid them before at the moment. Not quite, but it's getting there.
Off.
That's partly because the event is now much bigger, and we're heading for a common 200 attendees. Well, sorry, 200 connections to Zoom. Not quite, but close, and probably 250 attendees.
Lisa and Lindsey, do you guys have thoughts about musicians?
I must admit, I've never thought about what the bands can do for us, because I've always been so much more focused on trying to think of bands that we could possibly afford at Bristol Contra. I have taken, because Bristol, it's not a huge Contra specific community in the UK. One of the attitudes that I've had is that there are musicians that would like to perform more on Contra. It's a style that there's definitely some musicians like, but the way that Contra's set up, there's either nothing or there's what would be considered pretty huge gigs like London Barn Dance and the festivals and IVDIV. They're all events with over 100, 150, 200 people. They're big gigs. There's quite a lot of pressure. And actually, I've taken the attitude that Bristol is in this unique place where we can provide a smaller gig for the bands that are wanting to get some more practice. So my focus at the moment has actually been providing a space, a bridge between, to be able to hone your craft and get to those places, on the proviso that you can get to Bristol on a Friday night after work, which is a bit of a barrier. We're not quite sure how to overcome that, because the cost increase of moving to a Saturday is huge. So we're there. So I suppose, Ali, if you'd like to invent some more musicians that live close to Bristol, that would be my what that you could do for me, please.
Well, I like the
Lisa,
question because I'm a caller. So,
I
of
was gonna
course,
say.
I have lots of ideas. But I can tell you as an organizer, I mean, this is organizer 101, being very clear about your expectations, being very clear about programming. Like, do we have a waltz before the break? We usually play a hambo after the break. What does our dance do? Is it a hard ending? We have to be out of the hall at 10:30. That last waltz has to start by 10:20. That kind of thing. And also being really clear about payment. So most urban groups that have an umbrella organization because of taxes, they will be very clear about a guarantee. And then what happens to that profit sharing? That's great. Having a guarantee is great. That's the first question the band is going to ask you. And then of course I love those, bring little treats for the band if you can. I mean, I'm part of a weekly dance, so we'd go broke if we did that. But we try to treat them well by respecting their professionalism, by having a really good sound person. Boy, there's nothing worse for a band than bad sound on stage. And that's going to reflect out to your dancers.
That's something that is a different culture between the US and the UK. In the US, it tends to be the venue, the organizers provide the PA. In the UK, it's almost always the band.
Yeah, we provide sound. We have professional sound technicians who do this.
Bringing in sound technicians with them.
Except for smaller dances. Smaller dances, yeah, you might be bringing it in.
Yeah.
So we don't have the finance to do either, but we make sure we're the most helpful carriers in the world. We always make sure, I think the thing that goes in the first email to the band is you can reverse your car so your boot is almost inside the venue. That is the first bit I put on. And I think Andrew and Jane were there on the fated storm night where I
yes.
pulled up to our venue 25 minutes after the dance started. Luckily, half our band was local, so he'd been playing solo. I think the entire band was scooped in out of the horrendous rain and set up and playing within, was it 10 minutes or 15
Something
minutes?
like that.
It was impressive.
The half that was there had a fiddle. The half that was late arriving had a car full of electronic synthesizers, all of which had to be connected up.
And we mean
full. There was not space for even a cat in that car.
I know we're running out of time. I do have one other thing as a performer that I would like to tell all organizers. Please be timely in paying your band and caller. There's nothing worse than having to wait half an hour to 45 minutes if you're the caller and you don't have equipment because they're still looking through the till. As an organizer, I encourage you to do that. Take that time out, do it during the last dance so that as soon as that waltz is over, boom, you pay people. I mean, this is for large urban dances, because if you have a drive, waiting for to be paid it just feels hard.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
there are a lot of conflicting calls on your time
Right.
at the end of dances, but yeah, you've got to juggle them, get it right. There's
Yeah.
becoming a move towards electronic payment after the event, actually.
Ooh.
We've not been doing that ourselves yet, but I think it's going to become more common, partly because I think cash is going to disappear largely by the time we start up again.
Oh, can I just point something out? I am in the chat window, and Graham Knight has a good point about if you're an organizer, it's important to listen to various new bands. Boy, do I agree with that. If you can't listen to them, that's where your networking comes into play. Ask people, have you heard this band? This is our kind of dance. Do you think they would work? Yeah, give them a chance. I love that.
Yeah,
that's one of the problems with not having a large number of smaller series.
Yeah.
There just aren't enough contra events, even for the bands we've got, let alone for any new ones to break in.
Definitely. Yeah, also drawing on Graham's other thing of paying at the beginning. That's great in principle, but if any dance event is paying by split of door, you can't do it.
No.
So that goes straight back to the pay by electronic transfers. Like, without fail, I think every single Bristol Contra event I've had I didn't realize that, I'd like to pay more, but so I just hand out the PayPal, and people pay by PayPal, they pay by cash. Both work. And some of the dance, some of the callers and the bands, I go, would you prefer cash now, or how would you like to be paid? Yeah. It's probably about a 50-50 split between, just dump it to me on bank transfer later versus, cash now. And just work it, flexibly. And Bristol, we don't have a huge amount of financial, we're so tight on the finances, we try and find other ways. So trying to provide the musician or caller with whatever they would like. And similarly, no, we aren't just going to accept cash. No, we be as flexible as possible for the people that are arriving. If they can pay by PayPal, and that means they can pay extra on the sliding scale because it's not down to the pennies in their pocket, fine.
Right. I have one last thing to add. For those of you who are thinking, I'm in a new band or I'm a caller, I don't have enough gigs, start one. I say that to every young caller I talk to. I'm having trouble breaking in. Start a dance, but do your research. Write your mission statement and talk to the organizers around you.
And don't try to do it in the middle of a desert. There was the last, before Bristol, the previous attempt to start a contra series was in Newbury, which had not even any folk dance series in it at all. So it had no existing local audience, and it just struggled and it struggled and it struggled. You've got to have something to base it on.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Bristol's lucky in the fact that we don't have anything geographically close, so that actually our spread, we overlap just with London, and people that will come to Alcester will also come to us because they're halfway between them. Like, we definitely do better than most as a result. It also helps that we're on the intersection of the motorways, so even though it's quite large distances, it's still under the magic hour, which seems to make things work. We also are encouraging, or we have always encouraged, and it's also exists already, is that the ethos of, come up and stay over. There's people that will be do you know of anyone that's doing floor space? It's like, that works. And we as organizers host our musicians and callers so that they, it's not the expense of paying for a hotel. They're with us. We get to know them better. They get to know us better. It's all part of the community building. And the more of that you can do, the more spread you've got, the more people will spread your event. It's all.
And we have a ball.
And if you're an organizer who doesn't feel comfortable hosting, thanks to the internet, you can email your community and say, I am looking for a bed. We try to offer a bed. Um, can you, and with the parameters. And I always can find people to host, and they love it. As Lindsey said, it's part of getting to know people.
Mm.
Yeah. All right, I am going to call it an end on that beautiful note. I do, it's one of my favorite things as a caller is getting hospitality from people, including Lindsey. So thank you for that. And thank you all for being here again. Thank you, Lindsey and Lisa and Jane and Andrew. I think that we have had a really productive conversation here this evening, and I hope that the audience too has felt like they've gotten some insight from both the contrasts and comparison between the US and the UK, but also some inspiring ideas for their own communities. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to our audience.